Ambassador Herman Cohen. If he is in, we could have him ready. Okay, thank you so much. What an enlightening conversation panel that was there. Prior to this, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Sagaye, for your articulation, for explaining the deep-rooted problem of that empire and what the Oromo demands are. We thought this is relevant to be articulated for ourselves as well as for the international community, for Ethiopian partners as we go forward. And the previous panelists have also articulated how the grassroots democratic movement have been hijacked, and this is a continuation of that. And we really appreciate your presence, especially in short notice for joining us. I really thank you. The next panel that we have put together builds upon this theme already. The reason we put this panel together is to ask renowned experts of the region, people who have tremendous experience on Horn of Africa, especially Ethiopia, to come together in a roundtable discussion to discuss, given what is happening, given Ethiopia's history, what is currently going on, especially after the Prime Minister Abiy has come on board. Where is the country headed? What's next for Ethiopia? It's with this idea that we have invited these experts to come in a roundtable discussion to share what they think is possible, what lays ahead for Ethiopia. With this respect, we have asked them to ponder, is there anything that people of Ethiopia and the Abiy's regime can do at this point, given all the crisis? If the state continues, or if the empire continues on the current path, will it remain intact? What would be the fate, the territorial integrity of the country? What impact, the global impact, the recent Russian and Ukraine crisis may have on the region, in particular on Ethiopia? Will the war end soon? The active war that Dr. Sagaye Rasa have articulated very well, will that end soon? If it doesn't, then what complexity, what are we imagining the region to be? And finally, given this roundtable's expert, we want to pose this question: is Ethiopia capable of achieving democracy with the current structure? For this, let me begin introducing my panelists. Ambassador Herman Cohen is a well-known individual within our community. He has served Ethiopia, and he has continued to comment on the current affair of Ethiopia, and he stayed active on the situation as it unfolds. Mr. Herman Cohen is a retired he retired from foreign service. After his retirement, and continued to stay active. Prior to his retirement, he was an Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under President Bush. During this period, he had led negotiations successfully that ended decades-long civil war in Ethiopia, in Angola, and Mozambique. He has also served as an ambassador to Senegal and Gambia, and also received numerous awards and honors. My next panelist, Martin Clout, which is well-known, very active on Ethiopian current event. He has stayed up to date. A lot of the information we gather is actually from Martin Clout. I'm happy that you have joined us in short notice, Martin. He was born in South Africa. Currently, he's a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at King's College, University of London. He worked for the British Labour Party as a Secretary of Africa and the Middle East. In 1994, he joined the BBC, worked primarily on Africa. He has reported from many parts of the country. He specialized in the Horn of Africa. He became an editor of African Affairs, BBC World Service as well. He has numerous publications, Understanding Eritrea, Inside Africa's Most Repressive State. We would like his view on Eritrea's contribution to the current crisis in Ethiopia as well during his commentary. He has also published Unfinished Business, Ethiopia and Eritrea, War from Red Sea Press publisher. My next panelist, if he's here, please give him an access. Rogasa Ojera. He was born in Western Oromia, currently resides in the greater state of Minnesota. He has an extensive educational background, an associate degree in history from Addis Ababa University. He has an MA and BA degree in political science, and he has held many leadership positions. I'll cut it short because our time is going. I'll make it brief. He currently works as an analyst. He also holds doctorate in education. So we'd be glad to have him on board as well. Our next panelist also in this group is Terence Lyons. Terence Lyons, we have relied upon his research, his commentaries when it comes to Ethiopia. He's a professor of conflict resolution at the Jimmy and Rosman School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. He has received a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, was a fellow at the Brookings Institute and Peace Research Institute of Oslo, served as a senior program advisor to the Carter Project on Post-Conflict Elections in Ethiopia in 2005. He has consulted with US government and non-government agencies and organizations on the issue of conflict and democratization, so his voice is relevant in this panel. He has published The Origin of the Ethiopian People Revolutionary Democratic Front, Prospect for the Prosperity Party. And the publication is in 2021. It's an interesting book. And he has also published The Puzzle of Ethiopian Politics in 2019, Politics from Afar, Transition Diaspora Networks. Last but not least, Mr. René Lefort is also an active commentator on Ethiopian politics. We have also relied upon his insight, and he has kept us apprised of what is going on, what's the mindset of these different parties in Ethiopia. Mr. René Lefort has been writing about sub-Saharan Africa since the 1970s. He has reported on the region for many magazines and newspapers. He is the author of Ethiopia and Heretical Revolution of 1982. We'd be glad to have him on board. Please welcome all the panelists, Madeline, if they're there. We would like to begin, since Martin is ready, and since he's been active, and if you can briefly highlight what you think the current condition of Ethiopia is for the other panelists also to chime in. And this roundtable discussion, we encourage an exchange between you and the rest of the panelists to engage into to focus on ideas and where the country will proceed and how we can resolve the ongoing crisis in Ethiopia. Thank you so much. I'll give the floor to Martin Clout.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be here and to be speaking with you, especially as I don't really count myself as an Ethiopian expert, although I have worked on the area for many, many years. My entry into the Horn of Africa was, as you suggested, through Eritrea. And I visited there both during the War of Liberation and afterwards, although I certainly wouldn't return there now. I think I'd end up in a shipping container, courtesy of President Isaias, which frankly I don't fancy. You know, I think the one thing I would very much agree with from the previous speaker, was it Dr. Tsegai, was the point that he made about the role of the Eritrean state involved in what is happening, because I don't think that one can understand this, the current crisis in Ethiopia, and I'll come to the word crisis in a moment, without understanding both the fact that it is far more than the Tigrayan war, as has been made clear, but the appalling suffering that there's been inflicted upon the people of Oromia and of all the other peoples in the region. And in a sense, there is nobody who hasn't really suffered in the current situation. So it is really, really worrying that things are so bad. And I think one of the hands that you have to see behind so many of these activities is President Isaias. I mean, he has worked tirelessly to extend his reach deep into the Ethiopian state. He has his forces in Western Tigray, in Northern Tigray. He has people inside Addis Ababa. He is his security people are at the airport checking things. I mean, his role has really been extended enormously. And there are suggestions now of link-ups between the Eritrean state and the Amhara, that there have been up to something like 60,000 Amhara who've been trained inside Eritrea. And really, one has to see this, the situation as not a problem that is merely one that is afflicting the Oromo people or the Tigrayan state, but one that there's a regional conflict and a regional requires a regional settlement. Having said that, I think there are real problems with the way at which we look upon the situation. We use the word crisis, and I think it is a mistake, because the word crisis is actually derived from the medical terminology, where somebody goes through a fever, reaches a critical point, improves or dies. That is a crisis. It is something where at one point there is a moment when things will improve or get worse. It cannot be a continuous state of affairs. And so I think we should actually abandon the word. Things are critical for many, many people. I'm not trying to underestimate the humanitarian impact, but the word crisis is wrong because it suggests that something is going to change. And actually, I think what we have learned, not just in the Ethiopian context, in many parts of Africa, is that the situation is endemic. It is continuing and is not changing. This is the new normal. That is the African state that emerged in the 1960s after finally getting rid of the colonial presence, actually very rapidly descended into the kind of problems that we now see across the continent. The second thing I think we've got to be wary of is the bad man syndrome. We used to point to Mengistu as the bad man, to go no further back than that. Then it was Mellers, now it's Abiy. We always say, oh, if only we got rid of this man. This guy is polluting our politics. He is the bane of our lives. And I'm not denying that these people have had many serious problems and have done. The problem cannot be reduced to a single person any more than it can be reduced to a critical moment. We have to look at much deeper issues to understand what is it that has produced these upswellings of discontent and concern, which have to be grappled by people at a much deeper level. I mean, there are many, many elements in Africa, which I know from having worked on it for, 40, 50 years, that are powerful and unifying and bringing together and are very progressive, but there are many others which are not. And I think unless we begin to understand which are which, we will not reach a solution. Let me point to a couple of examples which are not African, which perhaps show us how difficult these issues are. And I'm sure you don't need to be convinced about how difficult they are, but let me just put them to you. What is 315 years old? I merely put it forward as a taster. It is the Union of Britain. The Act of Union was 1707. Is it a resolved state? It is certainly not. I arrived in the UK from South Africa in 1977. It was a united country. It was Great Britain. Scotland was a region, so was Wales. So, people didn't talk about Ireland much. They still don't talk about Ireland much, Northern Ireland. But still, it was Great Britain, and that was it. Today, we could hardly be more different. We left the European Union. We have Scotland might become independent. Wales might go down the same road. Ireland is almost certain to become Northern Ireland united with the South and become the single country of Ireland. So after 315 years and many more parliamentary debates than you have, than all of us have hairs on our head. We have no resolution. We have still a continual movement and reshaping of the way in which we live with each other. So I think we should assume, unless Ethiopia is very different from Britain, that there's never a final point that we reach at where you suddenly say, ha, nirvana, we've got the answer. Mm. The final point I really want to make is that there are some very positive things that one can say about the situation, looking at it from outside. Let me point you to three of the most catastrophic wars that have ever been fought. The 1870-1871 Franco-Prussian War, its continuation in the World War I of 1914 to 1918, and then the World War II with 1939 to 1945. Devastated not just France and Germany, or what became Germany, but the whole of the world was caught up in this grotesque struggle between what was essentially two nations for control of Europe. And yet, amazingly today, the people of France and Germany, on the whole, in the main, get on fine. Young French people walk across the border, they can't even remember where it was. Pieces of land which were fought over, and hundreds of thousands died for every square inch. Sorry, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I think you see what I mean. They died in their tens and hundreds of thousands for places like Alsace-Lorraine. Today, they happily share each other's customs. I think the hope we can have is that despite these terrible conflicts and the suffering that has been endured, and I must say, frankly, particularly amongst women, I mean, what they have endured, I've followed the Tigray war. To be honest, I'm writing a book on it, a bit more closely than anything else. I mean, it's beyond description. And yet, perhaps, even in the conflicts, there is some seeds of a solution. But I think perhaps we should dump the word crisis, reject the idea of bad men, and assume that we will always be trying to reshape our relations with each other. Perhaps if we have that as a perspective and watch out for President Isaias, perhaps we'll be on a better path. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think during the Q&A, there might be some question that would come up. Thank you, Martin, for that wonderful overview and your deep presentation here. Let me go to Professor Terence Lyon, and then we'll go to Boragasa, and then Mr. Rene will give us his take on it too. The floor is yours, Professor Terence.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for inviting me. I think you must be hearing me. I'm going to take advantage of sort of my professor role and try to place a couple of themes relating to what next for Ethiopia in a larger political context, and at a deliberately at a level of abstraction, to see if it's useful. The first thing I want to emphasize is that not so much in this room where people are so concerned about Oromo affairs, but in general, Ethiopia, the narratives around Ethiopia are now seized with the questions of Tigray and Fano and getting humanitarian supplies through Afar and so on. All these issues relating to the north of Ethiopia. Those are all essential questions, and the brutality of the war can't be overstated. But I would argue that if you were to go back and think about Ethiopia, where's Ethiopia going to be in 2025, 2028, 2030, not the impossible future, but the medium-term future, what you're likely to see is an Ethiopia where the center of gravity, if you will, is moving steadily to the south, not towards Mekele, but more to Addis or Finfine, if you prefer, towards the south. That's where the people are. That's where the demographic center of the country is. That's where industrialization is taking place. That's where the cash crops are coming from. That's where irrigated agriculture is in the south. That's where hydropower is in the south, broadly defined. And so as we try to think about Ethiopia in the future, I think we need to think about Ethiopia of the south. And of course, then all the more importance for Oromo politics and how Oromo fit in and to take their role, and how Oromo get their legitimate voice in a country that is less about sort of old Abyssinia, if you will, and more about a country that is, Willow Showa heading south rather than, Gondar looking north. Second piece of that, with the kind of thinking broadly about demographics and economics, is to recognize that while Ethiopia is still an overwhelmingly rural country, it's rapidly urbanizing. All of Africa is rapidly urbanizing. Ethiopia is actually a little bit behind the curve, but it is still becoming an urban country, as most of Africa will be, again, thinking maybe 10 years ahead. And so the future of Ethiopia, then, you begin to think about, again, not Kite necessarily, but maybe, Adama, Hawassa, Kambocha, Jima, the cities in the Oromia special zone around Addis, like Brayu and Soluta. That's the future of Ethiopia. It's in places like that. And as we try to conceptualize where Ethiopia may be going, where we may wish to think about how to encourage it to go, I think those things, that shift that's coming and is not yet perhaps recognized, is where I would start. My final set of points, really, maybe it'll just be a couple points, has to do with politics in Ethiopia, and particularly thinking about politics under authoritarian conditions. I think it's a mistake. I'll use the 2021 election as an example. I think it's a mistake to say, it was non-competitive, the Prosperity Party got 97% of the vote, they didn't even vote in certain places. It's not worth your time even to think about it. Because while those things are most certainly true, I do think the number was 97% of the seats. There's an awful lot of regional differences that matter for Ethiopia. And let me just contrast the Amhara region with the Oromo region. In the Oromo region, the story is a little bit simpler. It was, straight ahead opposition boycotts because the leadership was arrested and their offices were closed, and the leader really very, the heavy hand of an oppressive state that was well familiar from the EPRDF years took place. And in fact, I don't have the numbers in front of me, in the vast majority of seats in Oromia, there was only the Prosperity Party on the ballot. so they really, in Oromia, it was really solidly in the ruling party's pocket, Somali region as well. But the Amhara region was actually was significantly different. As it happened, most of the seats went to the Prosperity Party, all but 5, which went to Nama. Something like 30% of the votes went for non-prosperity party candidates. And that's very different than EPRDF elections in 2010 or 2015. 2005, as you will all know, was a different story. For reasons having to do with a very heavy, first past the post electoral system, and frankly, that the opposition parties diluted their potential strength by competing against each other and competing in seats they probably never had a chance to win. But that's a very different type of authoritarian system. And where does Ethiopia go between those two currently present models on the ground remains to be seen. I'm certainly not putting my, betting that the relative, although still quite limited, space for political competition in the Amhara region is going to be the model that then becomes the basis of a new political dispensation, but that it's not a single story is the main point that I want to make. And so politics in Ethiopia are remain, I think, very, very interesting. I wrote an article about the 2015 election that was called the 100% election. And people asked me, other than 100%, what is there to say about that election? But I thought that there's lots of interesting things to say about how the EPRDF operated, intra-coalition dynamics, generational things that were happening, that shows how politics is not simply a question of, well, this competing party's in an election and whoever gets the most votes wins. And that's what you do if you analyze politics. And maybe my final point, I said I had a final point, but I always have one more, has to do with more directly about Oromo politics. Some of the people, I heard a little bit of the question and answer earlier this afternoon. And a lot of people have been focusing on, for reasons that I understand, the Oromo collective agency. How do the Oromo engage in politics? What are the interests of the Oromo? And it's for the Oromo to decide that. I mean, I vote in American elections. I don't vote in Ethiopian elections. It's not my business. But I will say as a political scientist that it does not surprise me that a population of 35 million people have a variety of points of view. That's not at all surprising. The Oromo population is really quite substantial. I was looking it up a little bit ago. I think there's more in Oromia than there are, say, in Mozambique or Ghana. And only a few, Poland, I think, has 37, and there's 35 in Oromia. So it's a major country. What most countries, we would say, a major polity, to keep it away from a sovereignty frame. And in most places, we would say, so what's the political competition in that group? And there is that within the Oromo population. You do have the OLF with all of the repression and the problems of that leadership, perhaps. The OLA proposing a form of political violence as a way to get representation and to influence politics. The OFC, I guess, is meeting in the Wabi Shibeli this weekend and trying to get its act. That's the wrong way to put it. That seems dismissive. Going through the business of party building, of leadership selection, of developing a platform, the very nuts and bolts of what it means to be a political party. And I think this was a discussion that I heard earlier today. I think it's a mistake to see the Oromo Prosperity Party as a nothing. It's just a bunch of stooges and a bunch of people who were bought out for instrumental reasons. It's a lot of people who have joined that party for lots of different reasons. Some of it is for neo-patrimonial reasons, as most political parties have. Lots of ambitious young Oromo men and women are joining the Prosperity Party because it provides an outlet for their political energies. And just to say that it's all to be seen as, an instrument of some domination of nefarious actors, I think is a mistake, because it misses the very complexity that is at the core of the I won't say crisis, because I take Martin's point about that. Crises are supposed to end, but at the struggle for a more just and more liberatory or emancipatory Ethiopian politics. Let me pause there. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure. Thank you, Professor Line, for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure you will have some pushback on the idea of OLF and the population number, but we'll leave that to the Q&A to be explored. But thank you so much. I think you make some interesting cases for us to ponder. Let me move on to Dr. Gasa Ujira. He'll be presenting on the similar topic in his views. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ebisa. What's next for Ethiopia? This is a very loaded question that may not be answered by mere sentence or a sporadic debate that occurs once in a while. Yet, given the historical and political trends the country has traveled through, it's possible to predict what Ethiopia's immediate and long-term future could transpire into. I think, as I am the only one on this panel with Oromo Ethiopian origin, I may have a differing view as a result of my own lived experience, and rightfully so, because I am from the marginalized and major constituency of the Ethiopian state, that is the Oromo, and therefore, the Oromo predicament constitutes the center gravity that determines the future of Ethiopian political landscape, if not the Ethiopian state system. For me, political polarity that we see in Ethiopia today is as far apart as the 3,000 years versus the 150 years long-standing narrative. The root cause of Ethiopia's never-ending saga is rooted in its conception of history then. The political skirmishes that we have been witnessing during the last half century, or even today, to say the least. The hegemonic assumption, or I would say the myth, that Ethiopia could not set free itself from emerged when many tended to believe that Ethiopia is an ancient country that had been out there for 3,000 years, not more or less. And therefore, the 3,000 years myth has become the guiding spirit for most of the research and scholarly works around Ethiopia, non-Ethiopians included, for many decades or even centuries. In reality, maybe what had been there was the kingdom of Aksum, that is the present-day state of Tigray, and then the Abyssinian kingdom, which was interchangeably used with the name the Northern Highland Christian Kingdom, just to use the words of Dr. Tadesse Tamrat in his work, Church and State in Ethiopia. So contrary to the 3,000 years myth, Ethiopia as we know it today had been out there only since the last quarter of the 19th century, when the Abyssinian emperor embarked on a brutal conquest of present-day Ethiopia's southern territories, with the Oromo country as the major booty, to forge the Ethiopian state with the hegemony of the conquering core Abyssinian ruling elite, that is the Amhara ruling elite. That's where the Ethiopian problem starts. That's my view. The Ethiopian problem started with not only the definition, but also with the substance of what Ethiopianness entails. For those who claim to have created Ethiopia, Ethiopianness has hierarchical layers in which there are first-class Ethiopians, second-class Ethiopians, and so on, depending upon how the non-first-class Ethiopians pay allegiance to the first-class Ethiopians. It sounds like awkward to many, but this is what Ethiopia has implicitly gone through since its creation, with some relief to such assumptions during the Derg era to some extent, and during the EPRDF rule to seemingly greater extent, only to fall back with the coming to power of Abiy Ahmed and his co-EPRDF subservience to the core power at the time, which was predominantly steered by the TPLF. The reason why I'm bringing this historical perspective is simply to indicate the anachronisms of what Ethiopianness entails and how those Ethiopians are planning to sustain Ethiopia with such ideologically wicked but dangerous trend to peace and stability, even beyond the borders of Ethiopia today. For such wicked Ethiopians, all Ethiopians are equal, but some Ethiopians are more equal. You see, even a seemingly few progress Ethiopia has made during the last 40 or so years is being reversed by some ultra-Ethiopian nationalists with the help of the incumbent Ethiopian state apparatus with Abiy Ahmed at its helm. We have to note here that Ethiopian nationalism is simply synonymous with Amhara nationalism, and this has become a norm by all standards. Even the Amhara elite does not dispute this statement because the Ethiopianness that they wish to reign over all other identities should be an exclusive state ideology that squashes the multiple identities that should have made Ethiopia as it should have been. For example, the current battle against the Oromo self-awareness movement, Oromia, which is simply to mean Oromoness, attests to the struggle for supremacy by the proponents of the so-called unitarist state structure or Ethiopian nationalism. For those ultra-nationalist Ethiopians, Oromoness is an antithesis to Ethiopianness, and for them, therefore, both cannot coexist. So, the future of Ethiopia lies in to what extent this dangerous ideology of Ethiopianness could be contained and the lengths that this Orwellian Ethiopianness is going to go. It has to be noted that these ultra-nationalists were given the green light the first day Abiy Ahmed was about to restore the glory of Ethiopia's past in his acceptance speech when he was elected as a prime minister exactly 4 years ago now. It was not clear which Ethiopia he was referring to, the 3,000 years Ethiopia or the 3,000 Ms or the 150 years old Ethiopia, but assumably he had the medieval mythical manuscript known as the Kibra Nagas, or the glory of the kings, in mind. That's what I assume. Therefore, my first conclusive remark would be Ethiopia's future lies in its past, meaning Ethiopia's future will depend on how it reconciles itself with its past. The Ethiopianness, the Orwellian Ethiopianness I just mentioned earlier, and the multi-ethnic polity Ethiopia that we've known since the last quarter of the 19th century or early 20th century. There were missed opportunities, myths and reality had alternatives themselves from time to time in many attempts of reconfiguring Ethiopia as a multi-ethnic polity that should have reflected those 80 or more distinctive identities to live in equality and justice. Earlier Professor Tenz was reflecting on the future of Ethiopia into some growing urban areas or the resourceful areas in the southern part of the country. But for me, the future of Ethiopia lies how it reconciles itself with the past. I mean, there could be so many questions that could come up in the discussion going forward. With this, Imperial Ethiopia has remained at the top of everything Ethiopian, only to eclipse Ethiopia's true nature, that is, plural identities with distinct cultures, values, and demands for self-rule. The first such attempt, maybe one of the missed opportunities at the time, was made in 1991. I know, as a matter of historical incident at the time, one of the leading architects of the 1991 arrangement in London, on behalf of the United States government, Ambassador Herman Cohn is in this panel. He can speak more to this event. But what I would say, the imbalance that rendered the OLF a very negligible role at the London conference of the beginning of the battle that continued to rage between the ruling EPRDF and the OLF. Of course, with that, the Oromo people, of course, for the 27 years that followed. From my point of view, the Western powers' method of mediating conflicting forces in Africa only looks at who really presides over a considerable number of armed forces, than whose political home base is of paramount importance for a lasting stability and peace. The spirit of the London Conference that granted the control of Ethiopia to the TPLF-EPRDF in spite of the very decisive role OLF had to play in connection with its Oromo home base that constituted the critical center of the Ethiopian state, both in terms of geography and demography, was neglected. The EPRDF rule eventually succumbed to the cumulative resistance waged by the Oromo people, particularly the Cairo movement, under the OLF's motto of the right to self-determination as a guiding spirit. Then came this misguided new beginning. As we all know, in 2018, the popular uprising that toppled the hegemony of the EPRDF-TPLF was usurped by those who changed sides at the last minute from within. Abiy, the former functionary of EPRDF's security structure, who was even responsible for manufacturing false evidence against Oromo prisoners who were allegedly charged for acts of terrorism, all of a sudden emerged as a champion of democracy. Abiy was said to have been preparing false transcripts of alleged conversations between Oromo prisoners and the OLF leaders abroad. Such transcripts were supposedly taken from the Ethiopian telecommunication and were used as admissible evidence against Oromo prisoners in EPRDF's courts. So Abiy's rise to power was a misguided new beginning in which the old refurbished themselves as new. You can cite a number of people, individuals and groups that converted themselves from an old EPRDF to the new Prosperity Party. So Martin actually earlier, so Martin Clout stated that let's avoid the word crisis, but we're in crisis and it's a reality that we cannot avoid. It's just like our shadow that we cannot go away from. So with the current crisis, Abiy and his handcraft, the Prosperity Party, I call the Prosperity Party only the handcraft of Abiy Ahmed and his cronies.
Sure. You have a few probably.
States to begin with, yeah. So Abiy's Medamer was published as a main ideology for the guide to the future of Ethiopia. And with that, Abiy wrote his own terms of, the end of history. I come back to what the way forward should be. An all-inclusive debate that could lead to a transitional arrangement must be facilitated, not by the ruling party, but the major stakeholders such as the OLF, OFC, and other credible political and civic society groups. I have to stress the fact that the tenacity and stamina of the Oromo Liberation Front and the Oromo people's struggle, in spite of the most agonizing train it had gone through for close to half a century, must be a testament to the popular cause it does represent, and therefore should be brought to the center stage of the Ethiopian politics. Bringing the OLF to the center stage is tantamount to bringing the Oromo people's cause to the level that it truly deserves. Of course, I'm not speaking only of the Oromo rights alone, but justice is indivisible, and therefore all marginalized nations and nationalities in Ethiopia should have the right to their demands of self-rule in Ethiopia, so that a multi-ethnic Ethiopia in this sense would continue. The future of Ethiopia hence depends on a political arrangement that is consensually forged among its culturally and linguistically distinct identities that could translate into a new social contract between groups, not individuals, as we know in the classical theory of social contract, where no one could emerge as an oppressor. So with this, I will conclude my remarks with the teachings of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire in his major work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. In summary, according to Freire, that a full-fledged freedom can be attained not only when the oppressed is freed from oppression, but also when the oppressor is also freed from its acts of oppressing. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. I'm sure there will be some questions among you guys and Q&A from the floor. Let me give the floor to Mr. René Lefort, who has kindly joined us in a short time. His views are interesting and provocative, but we appreciate his presence and his insight. Mr. René Lefort, the floor is yours. I think you are muted. We're not able to hear you. Muted. Madeline, could
Now?
you unmute?
And now?
Now we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. So I thank the organizers for having invited me to take the floor, and I wish this conference every success. So the organizers ask us to answer the question, what next for Ethiopia? This is an impossible mission. At most, we can try to identify some major trends and then speculate on how they might articulate themselves in the future. And it's highly probable we will be completely disproved in a few weeks or months. But let me try. I see one main trend, the fragmentation of Ethiopia, which can be broken down into three major independent dynamics. This fragmentation leads to a situation that is known in French as leopard spots. After the widespread chaos of 2017, 18, 19, local situations are somewhere between two extremes: a gradual return to a kind of normalization with a growing hold of the PP, but less deep and less authoritarian than during the end of the EPRDF, and areas plagued by permanent armed conflicts, in a way outlawed, with their attendant insecurity, massacres, and exactions. This fragmentation has demolished the traditional pyramid of power to make way for a myriad of more or less autonomous local powers over more or less extensive areas. The collapse of the central power has led these fragmented powers to seek to assert themselves through militarization. According to good sources, the total of regional forces plus FANU and equivalents is now double that of the ENDF, not even counting the Kebele militias. This centrifugation is inseparable from the rise of identity-based feelings, often increasingly fanatical, which are themselves inseparable from an increasingly pronounced irredentism. Not a single Killil is free of territorial claims on all the Killil that border it. All this logically led to an intensification and multiplication of armed conflicts involving coalitions of military and paramilitary forces in an increasing barbaric form. The federal state and almost all regional states have long since lost their monopoly of the exercise of violence. So I would like now to try to relate these dynamics not to the immediate, in my opinion, temporary and singular symptoms, but to the effects on the resolutions of the fundamental question, the one that is at the heart of the crisis and that we tend to lose sight of. What new way of living together, or at least what mode of peaceful coexistence should Ethiopia try to build between its 80 nationalities and people? First, I think that this centrifugation is irreversible. This atomization of power is too far-reaching to expect that what remains of the central power could gradually integrate and subdue all these local powers in a foreseeable future. The case of Tigray is emblematic. In June 21, Abiy Ahmed had to admit that he couldn't defeat the TDF military. He stopped the ENDF more or less at the Tigray border. Abiy has just declared an indefinite humanitarian truce. It's impossible to say today whether this truce will be respected or not, whether it simply precludes a full-scale resumption of the war. But in any case, I don't see how Abiy can achieve his original goal of bringing down the TPLF. I think we are temporarily heading for the same situation as before the war, a de facto Tigray state left more or less to its own devices. Abiy probably couldn't wait for his blockade to bring the TPLF to its knees because he has other, more dangerous and urgent fronts on which to concentrate his few remaining forces. There is talk of 30 million Ethiopians in need of emergency food aid. This cannot be met without massive international assistance. Ola is now active even around Ambo. Abiy Amara supporters are grumbling. So it seems to me that the existential question at the heart of the crisis in Ethiopia has been practically answered on the ground. Barring dislocation, Ethiopia is heading towards a very loose ethnic federalism. So it is always argued that the so-called Amara hegemonists or expansionists form an unwavering bloc of staunch opponents of this type of federation. I think we need to enter into a more complex analysis, taking into account the meteoric rise of an Amara nationalism. I have been talking to Amara friends in the last few days, but only in the eastern part of the region. So it's what I have done is far from being a scientific survey, of course. So I asked them what people around them think. In short, these people told them, we thought and we were acting more like Ethiopian citizens than Amara. Because of this, we have not been able to come together and organize ourselves to be strong as Amara and resist the TDF invasion. Our priority must now to build a strong Amara nation. These people are also saying, let the Tigrayans do what they want to do at their home, in their home. We don't care. Trying to go to Mekelle is absurd. All we want is to take back our territories occupied by the Tigrayans. Desalegn Chanet, the previous president of NAMA, was asked, if you had to choose, would you stand for Ethiopia or for Amara? His answer was convoluted. In short, he says, Amara can serve as a center and can advocate for the rights of the other nationalities while fighting for its own rights as well. This is a far cry from the original aim of de-ethnicizing the federal system. So I mean by that even in the Amara region, an ethnicization process is underway, and that through this process, it could be possible progressively to break this Amara bloc and to integrate progressively some members of the Amara elites into this federal ethnic project. And here I don't mention the population, which from what I know is far from sharing the same views as the present Amara elite. So I think that beyond the events from day to day, Ethiopia is just at a tipping point where the most visible, but in my view, temporary confrontation in this crisis is shifting from Tigray to an Oromo-Amara confrontation. Its epicenter could be Addis Ababa. Ola will be one of a crucial actor of this move. This was, in my view, inevitable between the two most numerous nations with the two most opposed projects. So, if the observation I made are correct, this confrontation will be less about the type of system, federal system that will govern Ethiopia, than about territorial conflicts and the fate of minorities. Irredentis is virulent in each Kilil and in relation to all Kilil around it. The increase in the number of barbaric intercommunal clashes, so-called intercommunal clashes, in fact, pogroms, is catastrophic. A national inclusive dialogue is supposed to be the right process to tackle these problems. The one that Abiy Ahmed has set in motion is a farce. There is no need to dwell on it. He pretends to dialogue. The international community pretends to believe that he is dialoguing. All the other parties, armed and unarmed, are proposing the same process, but this time transparent, autonomously managed, and genuinely inclusive, with TPLF and Ola, some say. Even if this process is put on track, its chances of success are extremely slim, not least because of the fragmentation of the political landscape. Restructuring this political landscape is a prerequisite for this national inclusive dialogue to work. Regional political parties need to form strong alliances based on clear operational programs. These alliances must in turn extend beyond the borders of the Killing. A national dialogue cannot move forward with 100 participating parties. So this exit door is not within easy reach. It will be extremely difficult to get through, but I don't see any other way out unless we resign ourselves to an endless war and ultimately the end of Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation and insight from all groups. Before we even go to the Q&A, I wanted to engage the panelists with one another. Mr. Rene seems to have a different view than Martin. Martin, Mr. Rene believes or thinks the country has headed toward disintegration, and you believe despite the crisis, Ethiopia will continue to limp forward. Did I misunderstood that?
You know, I don't know why anybody asked me about the future. I was wrong about the end of apartheid. I was wrong about the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was wrong about President Trump. Why on earth do we discuss the future? Journalists are the worst people to possibly ask about the future. Listen, on the other hand, you know, the one thing I think we do learn from looking at Africa, you know, back to the 1960s, which I suppose is when I began, is the continuity of states is remarkable. And the number of disintegrations has actually been very small. And I would assume, probably wrongly, that Ethiopia will survive. I just hope that the endless battle between the imperial vision and the decentralized vision will be settled in favor of the decentralized vision and the federalist vision. Now, I know the Tigrayans, you know, shall we say, played games with it, but I still think it is the right vision. And I think anyone who thinks that they can reconstruct the old empire is, you know, on a hiding to nothing.
Thank you. Let me pose one question to Professor Terence Lyons. What should, especially the United States response be, since you're a conflict resolution, your area of expertise is conflict resolution, is there a mechanism that the international community could use to exert some pressure to bring some kind of resolution of the country? What do you think should the United States policy should focus on to mitigate the current problem?
Yeah, thank you. It's another kind of impossible question to answer, but I'll answer it in two ways. One is that I always, whenever I have an opportunity to speak to people in Washington who are engaged in the policy world, I always encourage them to be very modest in what they think they can do in Ethiopia or any place else. Most of the action is on the ground. 99% of what's going to happen, to take Renee's last point, in a coming, potentially coming Amhara Oromo fight for Addis Ababa, the US has nothing to do with that. I mean, they can't really shape the incentives, the strategies, the tactics of those different parties. What they can do, on the margins, some of it through messaging, some of it through good offices of having a special envoy or trying to empower Africa Union envoys and so on, very weak instruments, but still they're the instruments that exist, is to push for, I mean, to me, it seems to be a pretty easy set of three things that need to happen. And if the United States can help in some small way to make these more likely, then that should be pursued. The first is the humanitarian emergency. There's just well, in fact, you should set the humanitarian emergency aside from the political negotiations. Bringing food into Tigray should not be given as a concession in any type of negotiations. It's a crime to deny food to people, and it's been outrageous how long this has gone on in Tigray. And then a ceasefire. You can get food in so that people, the immediate emergency begins to be alleviated, although starvation at the level as exists, not just in Tigray, but also in other parts of northern Ethiopia and increasingly southern Ethiopia for different reasons, takes many, many years actually to recover from. But then a ceasefire, and I did argue this in the very first ceasefire that Abiy offered, is that there's really no such thing as a unilateral ceasefire. It's a nonsense on its face. A ceasefire is something that's negotiated between belligerents and has timelines and monitoring mechanisms and how are prisoners of war going to be exchanged and who gets to stand where and what army is going to go back to an encampment. Just to proclaim a ceasefire doesn't really, it's a rhetorical move, not a real move in reducing fighting on the ground. And I take most of what Renee Lefort had to say about the kind of growing, not maybe disintegration of the state, but the growing subnational security forces that are becoming so important in Ethiopia. The thing that most surprised me in the last 2 years is that the ENDF disappeared. I was shocked. Not all my life, but for years and years, I would say, now there's a strong institution. There's an institution that can do stuff. And I was completely wrong. That now it's the Fano, or Addis Ababa is relying upon the Afar regional security services, and so on. And so that notwithstanding, though, some type of dialogue, I think, is a prerequisite for ending the war. If you ask me, the conflict resolution recommendation. So it's going to be, most of the momentum, most of the direction, most of the decisions are going to be made by Ethiopians and Oromos, if you want to put it that way, and Eritreans, if you want to put it that way. And that's as it should be. This should not be in the hands of Washington. It should be in the hands of the people of the region to resolve. But to the extent that the United States and others in the international community can offer technical advice, help monitoring ceasefires, dealing with the humanitarian crisis. There are models. I think somebody else was talking about this earlier today. There are models of national dialogues that have taken place in a number of different African countries with different lessons. Many of them haven't been fully satisfactory, but this isn't the first place that the question of can a national dialogue be used as an instrument to end a period of violence. And there's ways that the external world can help try to distill those lessons and reflect them on, provide those lessons to Ethiopians and others in the region in hopeful ways that would make a national dialogue more constructive. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Ebza, can I make some remarks regarding this?
Sure.
I had in my notes, Professor Lyons, I had in my notes about these paramilitary groups that René Lefort had referred to also. For me, that's an indication of a crisis that the government of Abiy Ahmed is not in control. As you said, ENDF has disappeared almost because such paramilitary forces, the Amhara Fano, the Amhara Special Forces, the Amhara Militia, all these regional forces are taking government functions in which the central government is losing control of their actions. The Amhara regional state is invading Oromia regional states, parts of Wolaga, almost all of Wolaga, and the other parts of Oromia that are on the borders are neighboring the Amhara regional state are being invaded by the Amhara Fano and regional forces. That is a clear indication of a crisis. It's a full-fledged crisis. As you said, I don't know how far the international community can be useful at this point. Basically, the system is breaking up given the current crisis in Ukraine and Russia, of course. We are seeing that. That's one thing. The other thing you've referred to, the PP, Oromia PP, the Oromia Prosperity Party. I have a differing view. They are the replicas of the former OPDO who were stooges to the TPLF within the EPRDF, and therefore members of the Prosperity Party only represent their own interest, not a national interest. There's a difference between a national interest and a personal interest. It's basically a difference between realpolitik and opportunism. Those who represent their own individual interests as a livelihood are opportunists, but those who represent the national interest of their own country are acting on behalf of realpolitik. So, no, I mean, the fact that there are many Oromos in the Ethiopian bureaucracy does not mean that Oromos were represented. We have seen this during the imperial era. There were so many notable Oromos within Emperor Haile Selassie's bureaucracy. We have so many Oromos, notable Oromos in the army, the intelligentsia, and the Ethiopian bureaucracy during Mengistu's regime. The same is true during the Melese's regime, and that trend continued. But it did not transpire to the fact that Oromos were represented in the Ethiopian political and economic life.
Thank you. We will go to the floor, and I think Madeline would help me. In the meantime, let me pose two questions. One for Mr. René. What should the role, I'm going to probably pose the same question. What should the role of the international community be since Ethiopia highly dependent on foreign aid, war machine, and pretty much relies, the government especially relies on international legitimacy to push, to exert some pressure on the government to change course, maybe to reform or to embrace the grassroots movement, the democratic grassroots movement that was there, so they could receive some support. So if you could maybe look at how should the international community apply their forces on the government. And for for Martin Clout, the bottleneck for the humanitarian access toward the Tigrayan is it, as the regime says, that is it really the Tigrayans preventing the humanitarian access, or there is some other force outside of the Abiy's control that's preventing international access? If you could enlighten us on that. There's some diverse misinformation, I guess, that's coming out relating to the humanitarian access. Let me start with Mr. René.
Thank you. First, your second question. So I believe that the blockade of the government, the blockade of the aid for Tigray is of course deliberate, because the government always said that no, the fightings prevented the convoy to take the road, etc., etc. But if it would be the case, if the government was really willing to help Tigray, then an airlift could be organized, or this has been systematically refused by Addis Ababa. So that's the first point. Second point, the situation in the North Afar is not simple, okay? It's clear that there are local groups, Afar groups, on which the Central Afar Authority have no control. It's the reason why it was just suggested he said the only way convoys could reach now Mekele is with the protection of the ENDF. Because North Afar, the people are also in the desperate situation. And of course, they will try to get the food which will on this road. So is Abiy government really willing to let the air go? No, we will know it in the coming days, but in any case, it needs, I would say, a kind of militarization of the convoy if these convoys will be able to reach Mekele. Second, regarding the international community, I am very must say that all the efforts I have
I think, can you hear us? Hello, Mr. Rene?
Yeah, could you hear me?
Yeah.
Shall I continue?
You broke up. Could you go back with the international community? You were cut off. We weren't able to hear you.
Shall I continue?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. All right, first, the international community was totally fascinated by Abiy. And okay, this can be explained. But what cannot be explained is that a couple of months later, when it was very, very clear that Abiy was not the right man on the right place, they continue to find him absolutely exceptional. That's the first point. Second point, they don't understand the situation in Ethiopia. They are enclosed in this capital, Addis Ababa, with people, etc., etc. So the prisoners of this new emerging middle class, and these are most of them in favor of Abiy Ahmed. So through this prism, they see the situation in Ethiopia. Second, I am in favor of sanctions because everybody must be aware of the fact that the ruling group of Ethiopia is first and foremost an oligarchy, okay? And as an oligarchy, they are very, very badly hit by international sanctions. So I believe that international sanctions are a very powerful tool in the hands of the international community.
Thank you so much. Martin?
Yeah, I don't really have much to say about the blockade, which is clearly deliberate. I don't think we have to go into that in any detail. The only thing I would say is don't forget, people always talk about the blockade as being an Ethiopian or an Amhara blockade. Goodness me, it's an Eritrean one as well. The Eritreans could open up the border and let anything through from Assab, from Massawa, straight up. I know the WFP has tried it in the past and got nowhere. So, I mean, it is as much as an Eritrean operation as it is an Ethiopian one. On the international side, I very much agree with Terence Lyons about there ain't much that the international community can do unless they are absolutely motivated. I mean, as they are in Ukraine. And that's one of the things we can learn from Ukraine is when their head is on the block, by God, they can act. And I completely agree with Rene about the idea of sanctions. I mean, when you see what they've done to the Russian oligarchs, boy, oh boy, are they squeaking. It is a really major implication. I think that unless both sides are really, really willing, external assistance does not help a great deal. And I think we only have to look at, and I know Ethiopians will not like this example, but the decision that was arrived at the end of the last border war that Eritrea and Ethiopia fought, where you had the Boundary Commission, which came up with a gold-plated settlement for the border between Eritrea and Tigray. I mean, nobody could have a better decision than the one they arrived at, given that both sides said it had to be settled ex aequo et bono. Let us never forget that. And I mean, in case people don't remember what that means, it was that it had to be settled according to the laws, the colonial laws, the maps, and the traditions of the past, not according to fairness, not according to justice. That was what both sides agreed on, and boy, oh boy, they got it. And what happened when it was announced? Nellis wouldn't accept it. I nearly lost my job. They sent a minister to London to try and fire me because I pointed out that Badme had gone the wrong way from an Ethiopian point of view. They literally sent a minister to try and get me fired. Anyway, if you want to know where we're going, I think we don't have to look too far. Very interesting today that I see that General Abeba Tadessa has been sent to Asmara today. He's the guy who came out with the statement saying that he wanted to eliminate the Tigrayans and re-enter Mekele. Meanwhile, there are reports that 230 buses are taking Ethiopian forces from Dessie to Kobe. I think, we don't have to speculate too far about what is likely to be happening. Now, I hope to God I'm wrong, and I hope there's no more war.
Are you imagining a second war on the horizon?
I don't think it ever ended.
There are a lot of symptoms. There are a lot of symptoms. 260 buses crossed Dessie to Kobo.
Yeah.
You have around 80 guys in each bus, so it makes around 20,000 soldiers.
Wow, thank you. We have plenty of questions, but my last question to the panelists for Boragasa and Professor Terence Line. Has the United States policy toward democracy changed recently? Have we seen a shift from supporting grassroots democracy? Is there any updates or any change of U.S. policy toward the Horn, maybe Ethiopia? And for Ragasa, without the current federal structure, do you see a stable region or Ethiopia emerging for both of you? And then we're going to go to the floor. Any of you, whoever has much more gray hair can go first.
Less hair, more gray beard, maybe. Let me go ahead, and I think I can do the democracy piece in a fairly straightforward way. I mean, the first is that U.S. support for democracy was always an important value, an important part of U.S. foreign policy, but it was not the only thing. The U.S. did have interest in things like stability and counterterrorism that perhaps I think were driving policies towards Ethiopia rather than a single policy objectives. In the last administration, there wasn't much support at all for democracy. Although I do think in the early days of Abiy, there was great perhaps misplaced enthusiasm that there was going to be some sort of democratic transition, and the US was very happy to be able to associate itself with that. The only other piece of information is that Biden has, at least rhetorically, made global democracy solidarity as one of his signature moves. It remains to be seen what that really means. He's also framing the Ukraine conflict in those terms. This is where we have to stand up for democracy. So that's at least something worth watching to see if there is a greater support for democracy promotion, or perhaps, to put it negatively, to standing up or countering growing authoritarian trends in the world, both because of Biden's understanding of his policy agenda and then the way that Ukraine is reshaping global narratives. Let me leave it there. Thanks.
Without
Just I would like to make a few remarks regarding your question. I think the debate between a unitarist and a federalist structure in Ethiopia has been raging for a while. For me, federalism is just one of the political arrangements in a democracy. It is not an end in itself. What matters for us for democracy and freedom to reign in that country is for people to determine their future by themselves. The Oromos, the Somalis, the Afars, all other constituencies of the current Ethiopian state should decide their fate by themselves. This is called the right to self-determination. Then we can forge a type of a political arrangement that suits everyone to live in equality or whichever way. Otherwise, federalism is not an end in itself. Some people are, interchangeably using the term federalism with what has been known as the Federalist Papers that shaped the American Constitution way back 200 years ago by Alexander Hamilton and others. That is not the case. The way the current PP government is trying to create a federal arrangement is completely unacceptable. A geographic arrangement of federalism is not acceptable. If you call me a Western Ethiopian, it does not transpire, it does not resonate with me. But if you call me an Oromo, it resonates with me. And Oromia regional state, the Oromo federal state, is something that I can identify with as an Oromo. The rest will be the same. But if you call me a Western Ethiopian or a Southern Ethiopian or a Northern Ethiopian, it does not mean anything. That is what they are trying to do. And that's what they are preparing as a federal arrangement going forward. Otherwise, federalism is one of the options, but it's up to the people. First, they must be granted. The Ethiopian people must be granted the right to self-rule, and they have to freely decide their fate by themselves. That's my take on that.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to go to the floor. Madeline, if you could announce the audience who has a question, and then if they can keep it short, if they prefer, they can have their video on. But we would prefer a direct question and short question to these experts. Madeline, can we have the first question from the audience?
Sure. The first one will be Asafa Jalata. He's ready for it.
Professor Asafa Jalata, please proceed.
Thank you. It's very interesting to hear many views on this panel. First of all, let me comment on what Mr. Clout says. His position is very reductionist. He wants to free Abiy Ahmed from his criminal behavior. He was saying that even if regimes change, if individuals come to power, it doesn't matter, crisis will continue. He goes to Mengistu, Mallas, and Abiy. And this is, Abiy is presiding over neo-Netanyahu government, which is criminal, which is engaging in terrorism, genocide, gross human rights violation. I'm wondering whether you are studying what is going on in Oromia. Did you see people being burned, dead people burned, young people executed in public?
Thank you.
Did you see women burned, houses burned? And all these things, to ignore these things and say, Abiy is just an individual and it doesn't matter, it's very problematic.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Asafa.
No, I continue on Terry Hopkins, on Professor Lyons. He says that PP is almost illegitimate. Oromo members of PP are legitimate political actors. How can really illegitimate political actors engage in gross human rights violation, looting, killing people? I'm wondering whether exactly what you guys are generalizing, except the Rene Levert, is really based on a study. Just speculation, I think it would have been nice if you study actually what is happening in society, rather than making a very broad generalization without understanding what is on the ground.
Thank you so much, Professor Safajala. This just a little bit short on time. Martin, would you like to clarify your statement earlier? Did you capture his question?
Absolutely. And of course, I do not for a moment mean that I don't hold him personally responsible. Of course, he is responsible for any deaths, murder, terrorism, grotesque things which are happening. I'm not saying that not arguing that for a moment. Let me just very briefly say one other thing. It's argued people must freely decide their fate for themselves. In principle, I accept that, but one's got to be careful. You know, there are many states, if you went down that road, they would reimpose the death penalty, which thank goodness has been removed. But it's very popular in many states. In South Africa, for example, it was only through gritted teeth that the ANC gave rights to gay people, including the right to marriage. And I wonder how many. And certainly, if it went to a referendum, it would be voted out of court. So beware what you ask for when you say people must freely decide their fate for themselves. I agree with it in principle, but it must always be matched against the rights of the human rights of all people.
Thank you, Professor Taralines. His question was the PP. You got him, right?
Right. It has to do with how can I don't know if I ever said the PP was legitimate. I said they had political power. But the broader question is that my position is, as I try to seek to understand Ethiopian politics, and particularly Oromo politics, is that I can both accept that there were massive human rights abuses and massive acts of political violence in Ethiopia, and at the same time say there were political dynamics that are worthy of understanding and of doing research on and seeking to understand. I don't think the first position means that the doing political analysis is therefore waived because we've figured out that there's human rights abuses and therefore there's no reason to analyze politics. So I think both are true. I wouldn't deny for a second the violence on far too many actors. To go back to Renee Lefort's point of view, is that the decentralization of violence in Ethiopia is extraordinary right now. And so there's all kinds of militias involving and all kinds of violence. But that does not mean let's not analyze politics. It means that politics is in some ways all the more important so that we can understand these patterns of violence. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Madeline, next question, please.
The next question is Workana.
Please, we're gonna keep it short. Just
Okay.
a direct question would be best.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the interesting, in fact, insightful, excellent points about the dysfunctional former Ethiopian empire. My question goes to Professor Teres Lyons. You pointed an interesting fact related to where Ethiopia is heading the next 5-10 years, and the fact that Oromia is the center of all the political economic magnet.
Of course.
Why do you think is the honest and clear citizenship role of the majority Oromos are deliberately ignored by the international community, given the fact that Ethiopia can never achieve anything without a genuine and comprehensive answer for the question of these people for the fundamental human right protection, citizenship, political power on their land, and at least why US is wasting its time on the issue that is absolutely unrealistic to ignore 60 million Oromos and yet to try to fix the chaotic issues of the Horn. And Dr. Tsagai, yeah, I'm done. Dr. Tsagai, thank you for your articulation, but I have the last question for you. Does it give sense to still think Ethiopia still exists? Thank you so much.
Apologies, I have to leave. I'm so sorry. Thank you
Sure.
very much for having me.
Thank
Really
you so
cool.
much, Martin, for taking our invitation short notice. I
Pleasure.
appreciate you. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
I think this question could also go to all of you, Mr. Rene and Professor Lyons. Please proceed first.
Yeah, I mean, I accept the premise of the question. I think is that it's. I always think that in order to understand Ethiopian politics and what next, whether the state in Ethiopia is that making the Oromo the primary question. If I knew what was going to be going on in Oromia in 2030, I would have a pretty good idea about what was going on with Ethiopia, just demographically and the central position and the economics and so on. So I'm always trying to figure out the Oromo question, and I would and I do whenever I have the opportunity tell policymakers don't get so preoccupied with what's going on in the north to avoid asking questions about what's going on in the center, in the south. I'm not sure I'm often listened to on that point, but I certainly agree with you on that. Now, as an explanation on why, I'll talk to the United States since I know that better than some other parts of the world. The U.S. foreign policy has, it's among its weaknesses are that there's a tendency to very short-term thinking. It's the crisis of the day. People don't usually ask, what's the crisis that I need to solve in 10 years? They're short-term, their budgets are year to year, their careers are moving around. And so it's very difficult structurally for the United States to really come up with a longer term agenda. And that's always been the case. And I don't think it's going to end soon. And it's a real weakness of how the United States approaches the world. The second piece is that the United States, maybe for more understandable reasons, tends to prioritize security in a very particular way. Again, not a long-term human security, but a more short-term security of American interests, maybe narrowly defined. And so if Ethiopia, let's go back a few years, Ethiopia was perceived as being a force of stability in places, UN peacekeeping and in South Sudan and Somalia and so on and so on. We can debate whether that was all really true, but that was part of why the United States was accepting of a kind of Addis center, elite rather than what's happening in the grassroots in Oromia, a focus of policy. Thanks.
Thank you. Any more questions, Madeline?
Sure. Next up, we have Jamal.
Please be brief, Jamal, and direct your question and respectful to our guests. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Is Dr. Sagai around? I don't know whether he's still present.
No, Dr. Sagai was on the previous panel. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you. Let me ask the others. I'm sorry. Just one question for both. So Mr. Rene and Professor Linus, thank you for your presentations. My question is, in your community, in your country, wherever you have relations with people with, do you also perceive that the Ethiopian government is an Oromo government, or how is that perceived in your imagination or in your communities or within your government? And if that is so, what kind of diplomatic impact does it have on Oromo struggle? Thank you.
I think this question could go to all of you, Mr. Rene, and Rogasa could also chime in.
Yes.
I know Professor Lyon, they've been asking a lot of questions. Is it true that this government at the international level is perceived as an Oromo government?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I never heard a diplomat telling me something like, okay, there is a specific for this government, most of the ministers are Oromo, etc. Never.
I think this idea comes from some Oromo collaborators of the current Ethiopian regime, not from the international community. I've never heard of any foreign agency that described the current Ethiopian government as an Oromo government either. Few of our own from within us were trying to justify that this is an Oromo government. What do you want? So that these are the ones who had said the precedence for the narrative. There's never been a Oromo government. As I've said earlier, Oromos were in a higher government positions in the Ethiopian bureaucracy for the last 100, even since the creation of the Ethiopian state as we know it today. Why do we blame Governor Dache for collaborating with Menelik? Did he represent the Oromo people? He's being blamed for all the atrocities and for the mishaps that has been happening and is happening to the Oromo people this date. Therefore, even though Oromo-speaking individuals were and are at the top of the Ethiopian bureaucracy, it has never meant or did not transcribe to the fact that this was an Oromo government. It did not exist at all. Some misguided and wicked individuals from the Oromo community or the Oromo society tried to propagate this just for short-term gains.
Okay, let me ask just a general question. I know we're wrapping up. What advice would you guys have for the administration right now in Ethiopia to avert crisis or to move in the right direction? What insight would you provide? What counsel would you give the current regime to in terms of economy, in terms of security? What would you say? Professor Terence, could we start with you or Mr. Rene?
Boy, I'll go ahead and get started, although it's not my usual position. I mean, I'm always very circumspect in giving my advice to other countries or to other peoples. So my answer, it's not going to be particularly insightful, is to recognize the depth of the crisis that you were in, and recognize that it's going to be years to get out of it, and think about what you can do now to begin taking a step in the right direction rather than to turn the page and transform everything or have one mechanism that's going to resolve it. Ethiopia is going to try to get out of its current position, even in the best of circumstances. It's going to be a decade project. They're in deep, deep trouble. The Ethiopians are in deep, deep trouble. And so on the security side, on the economic side, the economy seems to be shot as near as I can tell. And on the political side, I'm just giving you some of my kind of biases rather than analysis. I don't believe in big solutions. I believe in incremental, step-by-step, little bit, learn, take the next step. But I believe that for everything. I'd say that to almost any government. So that's my answer. It's the same answer I give to anybody, is don't look for the single solution, but find small things and keep building on them and building on them. So I don't expect that the Ethiopian government would find that to be particularly insightful, but that's what I have.
Thank you so much. Mr. Rene?
Yeah. First of all, I had never met Abiy Ahmed, and I am forbidden to enter in Ethiopia. So there is very, very little chance that I could give my opinion. But if I will have the possibility of giving my opinion to the Ethiopian leadership, I would simply say to them, be realistic. Simply that, be realistic. Look at this country as it is. Look at the different situation, economically, politically, geographically. You must stop your blind ideology. You must stop it. Okay, be realistic. That will be my only advice.
Thank you. And Mr. Ragasa, what would you give?
I think as an insider and as an Oromo and as a person of Ethiopian origin, of course, I have the lived experience of what Ethiopia looked like, what it went through. Ethiopia has never been as troubled as it is today, where people are being burned alive, where paramilitary forces are ravaging the entire country, while the central government is only feasting on its parties in the capital and major urban areas. What Abiy Ahmed now controls is only the capital, Addis Ababa or Filfinne, and some major urban areas, and it's government affiliated and government medias. That's all. Therefore, what should happen is the current regime, Abiy Ahmed's regime, has done enough crimes that it cannot and should not continue as a ruling party with its ruling prosperity party. If it continues to do so, it's going to be a liability to the peace and stability of the whole, not only of that of the Ethiopian state. I think a new transitional arrangement is an imperative at this point, that we need the international community to intervene and assist with, helping other political forces, especially with the Oromo at the center stage of the current Ethiopian political turmoil, to play the leading role. I'm saying this not because I'm an Oromo alone, but because Oromos had always been the marginalized majority, but had always played the central role in providing material and manpower to the survival of the Ethiopian state. This has never been recognized. This has never been recognized by other Ethiopians, by the international community, and so on. Therefore, without bringing the Oromo cause, the Oromo politics to the center stage in Ethiopia, the country cannot sustain. Even the region is going to be immersed into chaos. The current trend is very, very, very dangerous. We've said this repeatedly. Paramilitary forces are doing raids of the neighboring regional states. You know what's happening in Oromia, especially in the Wallagga region of Oromia, and also in the other areas in Wollo, in Tigray, and so on. So I noted at one point that Ethiopia had declared war in Ethiopia, and this is a self-defeating trend. By declaring war on Tigray, which in fact was the core of the Abyssinian kingdom, that transpired to what's today Ethiopia's reconquest. By denying Ethiopianness of Tigray, they cannot even make Ethiopia into what it's going to be. This is
So you
not
see democracy as a way out of this.
Yeah, so the current regime, Abiy Ahmed and his cronies and his prosperity party should not continue to rule the country. It's a real crisis. I think Mr. Clout should have listened to this. We're in crisis. We should not avoid or escape a reality that we're living in. So that's what my take is.
Thank you so much. With that, it's an honor to have all of you, Professor Terence Lyon from George Washington, and Mr. Rene Lafort. It's really insightful to hear from all of you. Martin Clout also that was here. It's really a pleasure. I hope the administration listens to you guys' advice, change course before the horn implodes. But thank you so much. It's an honor to have you on OSA, Oromo Studies Association platform. I thank you, all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.